Good day to everybody. This is All Things Chess with CyberTao. I am your boy CyberTao. We're coming back at you. We're starting with our new course on hanging pawns. Brief explanation: I wanted to do hanging pawns immediately after isolated pawns because they are so integrally connected. Whenever you're playing an isolated pawn structure, 99% of the time, it will be possible to transpose into a hanging pawn structure. So, understanding hanging pawns is crucial to playing isolated pawns competently, just because at any point you can transpose into a hanging pawn structure. So it's impossible to play an isolated pawn structure competently if you don't know how to play a hanging pawn structure competently. There's some similarities, but there's enough differences that it is important to examine the hanging pawn structures separately and to try to gain a complete understanding of them. Just a quick example to get some hanging pawns on the board. Or we'll just do a Queen's Gambit accepted. Ignore the move order. We're just trying to get a position on the board. This isn't necessarily optimal opening theory. Knight d5, Queen e2. So from this position, if black chooses, this is an isolated pawn structure, if black chooses to take on c3, we have reached what is called a hanging pawn structure. Now, why are these called hanging pawns? The hanging pawns refer to these white pawns in c3 and d4. It'll always refer to this pawn couplet in the center. Now, there are some openings from either side where the hanging pawns will be, say, on e4 and f4 instead, and they share some similarities. But more often than not, it's the pawns on the c file and the d file. Now, why are they called hanging pawns? They're called hanging pawns because there's no friendly pawn protection on either the b file or the e file. So to just put a couple more moves on the board, again, ignore the fact that the d pawn was hanging here. I believe it was Aaron Nimzovich that coined the term hanging pawns for them. On c4 and d4, they're just sort of hanging in the air. They don't have any protection from the b file or the e file, so they're just sort of hanging in place together. The key to the position is whether these pawns are a dynamic strength or a static weakness. But definitionally, the hanging pawns will refer to these pawns usually on the c and the d file. Now, what are the advantages of hanging pawns? Hanging pawns typically allow for very dynamic play. I would say even more dynamic play than an isolated pawn. Just an example of what I'm talking about. In our basic isolated pawn structure, the knight will come to e5. It's typically a pretty good piece. This bishop on c4, it'll drop back to the b1, h7 diagonal. It'll be a pretty strong piece. But the rest of white pieces, they'll have to work a little bit to get employed, especially this bishop on c1, the dark square bishop. It doesn't really have a clear role. A lot of times it'll try to jump to g5 or jump to h6 if we manage to induce g6, but it doesn't really have like a superstar role. You go to a typical hanging pawn position, this bishop on b2 might be the best piece on the board because it is just slashing down this incredibly strong line diagonal. That is because of that hanging pawn translation of the position. Instead of the pawn being on b2, it moved up to c4. So now the potential that this long diagonal can open up for this dark square bishop is quite high. And it gives white's pieces a lot more scope. I would say white has a lot more dynamic attacking chances with the hanging pawn than in your typical isolated pawn structure. Another advantage of the hanging pawns, they control a lot more squares. You go back to a basic isolated pawn structure, there's no way for white to fight for the d5 square, aside from fighting with pieces. There's no pawn on the e file or the c file that can attack that d5 square. So that d5 square is the key to the position for defending against the isolated pawn. Black can always has a nice outpost square on the d5, where he can help solidify his position. You go back to a typical hanging pawn structure, that square is controlled. These hanging pawns control all the squares in front of them. There's no outpost square that black can create to completely immobilize those pawns. They're a lot more mobile than an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn, one of white's key ideas is d4, d5, but if the side facing the isolated pawn is sort of on point, that's never going to be achieved. That pawn on d4 is just going to be stuck there, and typically it's a more static game where each side maneuvers their minor pieces. And hanging pawn structures, there's a lot more pawn breaks. D4, D5 is a frequent guess. C4, C5 is a clearance sacrifice possible. These pawns are actually mobile, so it adds a much more dynamic element to the game. In my opinion, white has a lot more attacking chances with the hanging pawns than an isolated pawn. It tends to be a much more exciting game. Also, the fact that these squares are all controlled because these pawns are standing next to each other gives white typically a little bit of advantage in central space, so he actually has a little bit of a positional trump that he can rely on. Now, those are all the positives. What are the negatives of hanging pawns? Sounds like I've been praising the hanging pawns to the heavens. The negative of hanging pawns is that it's sort of similar to isolated pawns, that it genuinely is a pawn weakness. Especially the C pawn, that tends to be the main target for all of the operations. Now, when facing an isolated pawn, typically you don't want to transition to hanging pawns unless you can immediately immobilize that pawn that suddenly appears in the C file. Here, it's probably not a great choice to transition to hanging pawns because it's going to be really easy for that C pawn to move up to C4. There's no real good way to immobilize it. But a lot of the victories that you see against hanging pawns are when this pawn in C3 or conversely in C6 is just never able to move. The square in front of the isolated pawn is often key. With hanging pawns, the C4 square is often key. If you're black facing the hanging pawns, if you can control that C4 square and make sure that C pawn can't move, that's typically the key to the position, and it's often a signal that you're, at the very least, slightly better, if not positionally winning. Once the hanging pawns are able to move, it's harder to target that square, but you still could. After bishop a2, black could do something like knight a5, and then followed by bishop a6, and put 2 rooks in the c file. Because neither of these pawns have support from the b or e file, they are hanging there, so it's easier to attack them. If one of the pawns gets attacked, it's impossible to guard it with a pawn, so it just ties the attacking side's pieces down by defending passively. So typically facing the hanging pawns, you want to start focusing those hanging pawns and attacking those weaknesses. Ideally before the pawn can move, but if the pawn's able to move, you want to finish your mobilization and start attacking those pawn weaknesses. Also, when the hanging pawns are a drawback and then they're a genuine weakness, similar to isolated pawns, if you're facing the hanging pawns, any trade favors you, especially minor pieces. These bishops especially, they're often a target for neutralization facing them. If you can get the bishops off the board, especially that light square bishop, which is also an isolated pawn, sort of a frequent guest for devastation. If you can get those bishops off the board, it often helps your quests quite significantly. So really the general breakdown for hanging pawns is that the side with the hanging pawns wants to keep pieces on the board and shoot for a kingside attack, just like an isolated pawn. You want to shoot to keep these pawns mobile. Ideally, you want to keep these pawns abreast, because when they're controlling all the squares in front of them, it's impossible to blockade those pawns. So there's sort of a strong dynamic force in helping control space. You want to make sure you can move this pawn initially. If you transition to hanging pawns and this pawn never moves from c3, it's much easier for the side facing them to blockade that c4 square and get a grip of the position. Conversely, the side facing the hanging pawns, you want to try to get minor pieces off the board. You want to neutralize as much as possible, get to an ending, and then start proving that these pawns are in fact weaknesses. So that's just sort of the general definitional breakdown with a sort of rough sketch of what we're going to be doing. We're going to start tomorrow by looking at example games of how to play with the hanging pawns. We're going to be looking at a lot of gorgeous attacking victories, because that's really the goal with the hanging pawns. It's either knock out or be knocked out. So tomorrow we're going to start with looking at some beautiful example games of attacks. Until then, my name is John, and thank you for joining me.